and get us started. We are here for a conversation around the exhibition Alison Saar of Aether and Earthe, which is one exhibition at two venues, the Armory Center for the Arts in Pasadena and the Benton Museum at Pomona College of Art in Claremont. My name is Irene Georgia Tsatsos. I'm the Armory's Director of Exhibition Programs and Chief Curator. I want to thank my colleagues, Leslie Ito, the Armory's Executive Director, and Eber Rodriguez, Exhibition Program Production Manager, who's helping ensure that this event runs smoothly, and our friends and colleagues at the Benton, including Director Victoria Sancho-Lobos, and of course, my colleague, friend, Rebecca McGrew, the Senior Curator at the Benton. Starting tomorrow, the Armory joins the Benton in being open to the public by appointment for this exhibition, Alison Saar of Aether and Earthe. We couldn't be more excited about this long-awaited date. Appointments for the Benton and the Armory can be made on each organization's website. Before I go any further, I would like to acknowledge that the Armory Center for the Arts in Pasadena and the Benton Museum of Art in Claremont acknowledge our presence on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Tonga and Kizh peoples, whom we recognize as the traditional caretakers, as well as the current and future inhabitants of the land we occupy. Personally, I'm speaking from Waganga, the ancestral home of Wangang Vitam, who are now known as the Fernandino Tataviam Band of Mission Indians. We offer our deepest respect to Tongva, Kizh, and Wangang Vitam elders, past and present. Let's see, I said earlier, but I just want to make sure people are aware that we're recording this event. We will be posting it on the Armory's website probably next week. I also, a little more acknowledgements here. I want to thank our funders. Major support for Alison Saar of Aether and Earthe at the Armory comes from Pasadena Art Alliance, with generous support from the California Arts Council, a state agency, and additional support from Betsy Greenberg. Special thanks as well to our community partner, NAACP Pasadena. Lead support for the exhibition catalog comes from the Fellows of Contemporary Art. At the Benton, additional exhibition support comes from the Janet Inskeep Benton 79 Endowed Fund, the Carlton Seaver Fund, the Dr. Lucille M. Paris Endowment, and the Eva Cole and Clyde Matson Memorial Fund. I also want to thank our lenders, all of our lenders who have been so gracious and generous and accommodating of the many changes that this show demanded in order to, just work around and with and under the circumstances of COVID. I also want to thank Kimberly Davis at LA Louver for her incredible support throughout this entire process. Kimberly Varela of Content Object Design Studio for the graphic design of the beautiful publication that accompanies this exhibition. I want to now bring up the wonderful Rebecca McGrew, Senior Curator at the Benton Museum of Art at Pomona College in Claremont, and my curatorial collaborator on this exhibition. Rebecca will speak in a moment about kind of give an overview of the exhibition. First, I want to introduce Alison, who I hope you're up on the screen too, Alison Saar. Alison Saar has become internationally recognized for her figurative sculptures, paintings, and prints. Telling stories that focus on personal and cultural narratives, Alison imbues her figures with agency and strength, often arming them with personal belongings or tools to convey their tenacity, resilience, and communal significance. Her provocative and moving work opens up vital conversations about how art can address race, history, and identity, and facilitate understanding and transformation. I'm going to turn it over to Rebecca, but first I want to just cite the beautiful exhibition photography by Ian Byers-Gamber and Frederick Nilsson, work that you will see in a moment. We're going to start screening, kind of scrolling through a few installation shots from each venue. And I also want to say that we intend to allow room for chat at the end of, or for Q&A at the end of this conversation. So please put your questions into the chat and we will be monitoring those. Rebecca, please tell us about the show.
Hello, yes. First, let me just thank everyone. There are so many people to thank, all the people who you just mentioned. But I can't believe after all this time we are here. We're here in a Zoom event, but yet tomorrow, I think many of us may be actually at the Armory celebrating the Armory's opening in person. And I look forward to that event. I will see people tomorrow in person and be able to give them hugs, although now we're wearing masks again. So I still look forward to that. And I'm just so grateful to our lenders who have allowed us. I think we changed our loan dates at the Benton 3 or 4 times perhaps, and now we are aligned. We will be open at the same time and we will be closing in the same time in December. So I'm just so thrilled to be here with Irene and Alison. And now let me tell you a little bit about the exhibition. So Alison Saar of Aether and Earthe is, as we know, is one exhibition in 2 venues at the Armory Center for the Arts and the Benton Museum of Art at Pomona College. So Alison, Irene, and I conceived a survey exhibition of sculptures, installations, paintings, and drawings that focus on Alison's exploration of female imagery for over 40 years. In particular, we wanted to focus on her examination of the intersections of gender and race. Her predominantly Black female figurative sculptures are endowed with muscular limbs, solid torsos, and a determined assertion of their rightful place. And they've always been grounded in a sense of sight, while also enlightened in matters of the soul. So sight and soul. All the work included in Of Aether and Earthe embodies Alison's signature aesthetic of figures composed of rough-hewn forms and humble found materials that convey personal and cultural narratives. Her work and the work in the exhibition, as you can tell from the title, is rooted in the connections between earth and spirit, and her complex iconography explores dualities and binaries of body and spirit, and also myths and archetypes, invisible bodies and hidden histories, and timeless paradigms of grounding and transformation. So the exhibition title of Aether and Earthe suggests transformations of elemental properties, with ether representing the spiritual and non-material, and earth, with the archaic spelling with an E at the end, suggests a rootedness in physical materials. So here you're seeing, as you scroll through this, these images, we see how the work at the Armory suggests elements of air, fire, and ether, while our exhibition at the Benton emphasizes works with grounded, earthly, and watery qualities. I also like to think of ether as the material that connects our 2 spaces and moves in and around in between all of us in the ether and in physicality. So these themes have manifested in Alison's work from 1982, with the earliest work included Voluptuous Mummy. You can see it right now on the screen. It's a small sculpture in front of high cotton. And with the 2 most recent, Hygeia, which you're looking at right now on the screen, and Imbue, which we installed in May 2020, which is a bronze public sculpture which Pomona College commissioned on the occasion of our new museum building. So now we are turning to questions, and I think I would like to ask the first question, let's see, about Voluptuous Mummy, Alison. So as you know, it's the earliest work in the exhibition from 1982. It's also the 3rd sculpture you created following Si J'étais Blanc and Backyard Dog around following your MFA at Otis in 1982. So I'm hoping that when I'm done with my question, you could share how the sculpture reflects your upbringing with your parents and their influences, which I'm thinking of in Voluptuous Mummy, the pieces of linen going around it. And I also like how it is a direct precedent to your later work, much of which we just saw right now. We see in the sculptures of the female figures that echo Voluptuous Mummy's formal qualities and your influences of other cultures, histories, and myths like Scar Song from '89 and Inheritance from 2003. Another thing that, as we saw in one of the install shots, Voluptuous Mummy is in the center of the gallery. And when I give tours, I really start there and then move around because it's a starting point and it helps to shape our exhibition story. So I would like if you could discuss it in the trajectory of your work.
Okay, well, hi, thank you both for those lovely introductions of both myself and the show. And thank you to the Benton and the Armory for hosting this exhibition. I'm really thrilled to be part of it, or it, I guess I should say. So yeah, so Voluptuous Mummy, you know, all three of those pieces that you cited, Si J'étais Blanc, which is in my mother's collection, and Backyard Dog, which is in my sister's collection, and Voluptuous Mummy, you know, they were all really early. Some of them were in my MFA show. The first two were in my MFA show while at Otis. And I think it was sort of my epiphany moment. You know, I had been doing abstract work up until that point, and I just suddenly decided I wanted to make a figure. It felt to me that that was the most direct way to talk about abstract ideas and the idea of the spirit and the unseen, and the best entry to that was something figurative, which seems counterintuitive, but that's kind of how I arrived at doing these pieces. And Voluptuous Mummy, you know, I guess throughout, starting in junior high school and then high school, I worked for my father, who was an art conservator. And so, you know, after school, I would take the bus or later on walk to his studio, and, you know, starting off, you know, just washing brushes, but then eventually being trusted to actually do some work. But all of the scraps on Voluptuous Mummy, her wrappings, are trimming. So he would sometimes have to trim off old linens to back them and remount them. And so I kept them. So I love this idea that, you know, some of these pieces are probably quite old, probably, you know, from early 1800s, I guess, some of them. And so I love that this sort of material had this history, and that kind of also led me on this trajectory of materials and materials having histories, and maybe having a little bit more wisdom than I did, being 26 or 27 at the time that I made the piece. Also, some of the other stuff like scraps of metal and things were just things I'd pick up in the alley behind my father's studio. He was in West Hollywood on Melrose. And so it was kind of a real sort of accumulation of things. And then the face, which is mosaic, really kind of reflects my mother's influence and the Watts Towers. And, you know, I guess my great grandmother lived near the Watts Towers. And so, you know, when my mother was growing up, she actually witnessed Simon Rodea working on the towers. And it was kind of like the first place I remember going to see art, actually, was, aside from like the Natural History Museum, which my father worked at the time, was going to the Watts Towers and just being in awe of these astounding structures, and that they were made with little scraps of, you know, discarded tile and ceramic objects and plates and things like that. And so her face is actually a mosaic. And that kind of is sort of a tip of the hat to Simon Rodea. So yeah, kind of looking at those two influences, my father really having been trained in Western art. And so I think, you know, Egypt kind of spans that, where, you know, it's claimed by the Western world, but it's actually on the continent of Africa. And then, you know, my mother's influence being largely looking at non-Western art of Africa and Mexico and the Far East and South and Central America. So yeah, and that funny one little piece, I think it really points to a lot of directions of influences that came from my parents and my upbringing.
Would you also go further and place Voluptuous Mummy toward other artworks that are in the show, and how it might be a precursor or show some of the same kind of formal qualities?
Yeah, well, I guess also because the first two figures, one was a man and one was a dog. You know, I think this is really, and it's kind of, you know, it's my title is a little bit of a joke. You know, she's being this voluptuous mummy, but she's of course completely clad. So it's kind of really hard to tell how voluptuous she went, how much body there is under that. But you can kind of, you look at it, you can kind of see how it curves out and all of that. And so I think that really started talking about my interest in the female body and how, you know, historically it's been sometimes concealed, sometimes not concealed, and how it's always kind of had to play a role in, you know, it always had to function to the artist's whim in a weird sort of way, which in some cases has been abusive. And I think the work that I'm doing now really reflects kind of that history of how the female, specifically the Black female body, has been depicted in Western art. And then I'm also intrigued in how it's depicted in non-Western art as well. So I think that's kind of evident in that piece, and that, you know, maybe I definitely wasn't cognitive of it at that time, but I think maybe that was the first sort of seedling of going in the direction that, you know, both of these exhibitions focus on.
Thank you.
Sure.
Yeah, I was just musing on which question to follow this with, because I have several, but I think I'll stick with script here, and I guess it turns our direction ever so slightly, but I would like to discuss some of the contortions performed by the figures in your work, specifically those of Blonde Dreams and Pearly. These are two very different works, yet both feature women being suspended. Pearly is a depiction of Miss Lala, a mixed-race circus performer born in 1858 who toured Europe and the United States performing legendary stunts in midair while hanging from ropes and other devices solely from her teeth. She was, as you noted, characterized as exotic, half female, half male, an Amazon. She's demonstrating a performance of strength and control, but if she were to let go, she would fall to her death. In Blonde Dreams, a Black female figure is suspended by her ankles, letting her long golden hair hang loosely. You're referencing here in this work women of color aligning with Northern Eurocentric beauty norms, whether by dyeing or straightening hair, lightening skin, or undertaking plastic surgery. The figure in Blonde Dreams pushes against these conventions and at the same time gives up something of herself to fit in. She is seemingly in limbo, like the fairy tale character Rapunzel, who offers part of herself to someone else in order to be released from captivity. Both works reference vulnerability, susceptibility, and the possibility of escape. I'm curious to hear you speak about your ideas of constraints, both internal and external.
Oh, well, I think, you know, often those constraints are misread, that, you know, that these, I think what I really want to talk about more is how, well, I guess actually those pieces are very kind of contrary in certain ways, but, you know, in some ways trying to give that power back to those women, whether, for example, specifically in Blonde Dreams, you know, she is kind of like, sort of hanging herself out to dry, so to speak, and that, you know, she's kind of what do you say? She's kind of fed into this sort of myth that if you have long, blonde, beautiful hair, Prince Charming will come along and save you and take care of you. And so it's kind of like, you know, feeding into this sort of idea of Western beauty as being, you know, the ticket to freedom and acceptability. And so she is basically in a trap made of her own, you know, of her own ideas and her own sort of desires, I should say, a trap of her desires. And so the hair is actually, you know, again, that's kind of references back to working with my father, where I learned how to do gold leaf. So it's a very traditional gold leaf red bowl underneath the gold leaf. And, you know, again, kind of playing into this sort of, you know, Western idea of beauty, that gold is what's great. And then her skin is covered in tar. And, you know, from being you know, being tar and feathered was something that was done often to slaves as a punishment. And this idea, you know, that, you know, derogatory terms of someone being tarry black or tar skinned or something like that. So it's kind of playing off of these two sort of polar ideas of beauty and you know, unbeautiful. So she's kind of, by believing that lie, has kind of got herself in this position. And, she's tied up by her feet, which gives her the ability to free herself. So if she wanted to, she could toss aside those mythologies and those backwards ideas of conforming to Western beauty and just embrace herself as she is. However, Pearlie, I think what was really most frustrating when reading about Miss Lala was that she, was this incredible athlete, and they would refuse to recognize it as that. And they would say it's because, like you said, part Amazon or part ape or something, extraordinary, or, some sort of anomaly of nature, and not really giving her due for just being a really finely toned, incredibly strong female athlete. And so, on one hand, I wanted to talk about her strength and her ability to do these incredible feats, but also how she was vulnerable to how she was being viewed and how she was being played up and presented as this kind of like, unnatural thing, as opposed to a male white or even a female white athlete would have been given their due in terms of their, their training and their hard work to get to that point. So, yeah, again, she also has the option to not do any of that, leave that world altogether. But, I think in some circles, she actually was recognized, and apparently she was paid quite well, and she toured all over the Europe. So, she was definitely reaping the benefits of it, but it was still only, it was only conceded to her through these sort of derogatory terminologies. And, I think as a sculptor, and I think sometimes even as a person, I think, weight is such an interesting thing, that I love this idea of weightlessness, and that these figures and other figures in both exhibitions actually are defying gravity, and that they are kind of in this sort of magical state in this other place. And, I think the first place people go when they see these pieces hanging is lynchings. But I really want to talk about more how sometimes we not offer ourselves up to those, let's see, I think sometimes it is how we, by buying into certain restraints and obstacles that are placed in before us, turning the other cheek or looking the other way, or certain behaviors that we had to do just to survive day to day. I think now we're kind of seeing ourselves really loosening ourselves from that grasp. But, that we really have to kind of take a stand to push back against all of those sort of obstacles that are put in our way, or else we somehow are contributing to that. If that makes sense, that we really need to kind of be pushing back. So that's sort of how I respond to this idea that they are lynchings. In some ways, it's how we, not offer ourselves. I keep going back to that terminology, but how sometimes we don't allow ourselves to kind of be all of who we are, because of still feeling the weight and working underneath the burden of the way US, and I would say even global society has kind of put those constrictions on the Black body. How's that? I love that, actually, if I can mention that, what's really wonderful about the installation is at the Armory is that, she's always been, intentionally hung high, that you're really looking basically at her toes. I think she's even higher than 8 feet. But what's wonderful with the mezzanine in the Armory is that you can actually see her face. So the first time people can see her face, and you can look down her. And actually this view here is actually a Pearlie's eye view of the gallery from up on the 2nd floor.
Yeah.
Alison, this is a little bit out of left field, but as we've mentioned earlier, your work explores current and historical events. For example, and you'll see it coming up here, the massive sculpture Breach from 2016 responds to 2 natural disasters that impacted communities in the South, There it is. There's a good view of it from the side. The tragic aftermath of Hurricane Katrina in 2005 and the Great Mississippi River Flood of 1927. Our bronze public sculpture Imbue, which echoes Breach in its, we don't have a picture of that, unfortunately. You'll just have to come to the Benton and see it in the courtyard. That references the transatlantic crossing with water imagery, Yemaya, the goddess of waters and protection. It includes cowrie shells, images of broken chains, and a small image of a ship. I recently noticed, Alison, that your work is going to be included in the new Montgomery, Alabama site for the Equal Justice Initiative, and a museum founded and directed by Brian Stevenson that he states provides a broader understanding of slavery and racism's lasting impact. Stevenson also plans to acknowledge the more than 2 million Black people who died during the transatlantic passage. While your work will be in a separate art gallery from the historic displays, as my understanding, it will be in conversation with the history. So I'm wondering where you see your work fitting in at the Equal Justice Initiative, and how your work, and if there's work on view at the Armory and the Benton that examines these histories of the Black Atlantic.
Well, first off, I just would like to say that the Equal Justice, the EAI is, or EJI is really an incredible institution. Aside from the really phenomenal museum and exhibition and memorial space, is really the work that they do in terms of helping represent the incarcerated, and also assisting with their families. It's just a really incredible institution, and the prospect of being part of that collection is just really very exciting for me. It's just, I have the utmost respect for what they do. So that said, yeah, I think I think it's in some ways, I think what's really phenomenal about the memorial is, that it really is just stating these facts. I mean, it's a very austere sort of installation of these plinths. I have not been there in person, which I'm excited actually to go hopefully later before the fall or something to be able to visit myself. But, it's just a really powerful space talking about a really horrific, frightening history. And I think, that, in what we're experiencing here and now, in terms of the visibility of the continuation of such injustices, often by the hands of law enforcement. It's just really an incredible, important space to have out there, and to, again, to sort of reiterate what, African Americans, Blacks in the United States are experiencing on, a daily basis. I think the work has always dealt with, not exclusively, but, going back and looking at Breach specifically, I think what was really disturbing about Katrina, and what led me to look into the history of the Great Mississippi Flood of 1927, was that, everybody experienced the natural disaster, but only Black and brown and extremely poor people experienced the aftermath of racist actions taken to kind of further exemplify their suffering. And for example, the Great Mississippi Flood, Black males were conscripted to shore up the levees, and they were not, present to be able to help evacuate their families. And then when they were evacuated, they were placed on the levees. There was encampments of African Americans on the levees. And part of that was to keep them from escaping and fleeing north, or, leaving these sharecropping farms that they were indebted to, the crops now being lost and underwater. And so it was just insult upon injury. And then to see kind of how that history was repeated in itself. And when you would see people stuck on the freeway overpasses. You could kind of do these images by images in terms of looking at the way people were being, herded into the dome, and the way people were being stranded on overpasses and not allowed to cross over the river to dry land in other counties. It was just incredible to see, some 80 years have passed and we're still experiencing the same racist policies. And so I think, often the work, when they are referring in reference to these catastrophic events, relates a lot to what the EJI is doing in terms of really trying to bring these stories to light. I think it's really interesting in the recent history of the Tulsa massacre. There are just so many people, Black and white, that didn't know that history. And of course, now that it's out, and maybe now we can start talking about reparations and all of that. So there's still much work to be done, but I think the first step is bringing these stories to light and really letting people know how dark the history in the United States is and continues to be against people of color, African Americans, Blacks, and Indigenous Americans as well.
Thank you, Alison.
Yeah.
Alison, what work of yours will be there?
We're still working on that. Thank you.
Okay. I will wait to hear. Thank you.
Right. Great.
Thanks. I want to encourage our visitors to post questions in the Q&A. I am going to continue with one more question here. And it's a little bit, it kind of, you'll see that it kind of dovetails off of the earlier conversation around voluptuous mummy. But maybe there's a little more there to discuss. One of the many effective things about your work, Alison, is the way you handle timeless myths and familiar imagery in new, fresh, and contemporary ways. Snakes, female nudes, draped forms, these images have rich representations and associations throughout art history. We've seen many representations of Persephone and Demeter, the myth of the mother and daughter, such as sculptures from the Parthenon, absconded by the British and now held by the British Museum, to your works, Equinox at the Benton and Brood at the Armory. In these works, you've personalized and overlaid the experience of motherhood and the inevitable loss that accompanies it onto an ancient story that is so often portrayed as an exercise of political power, property, and entitlement. At the Benton, we see Aphrodite channeling the ancient Greek goddess of love and beauty through Yemaya, the Yoruba water deity. And at the Armory, we have your newest piece, Hygeia, the ancient Greek deity of hygiene and health. Hygeia is revealed here as a woman of color occupying the often invisible role of cleaning woman or charwoman, while nurturing her considerable mystical powers through her familiar, a silver snake, and her tools at hand, including a silver double-headed broom. In all of these works, you translate across cultures and you humanize deities, while at the same time imbuing them with additional powers or new takes on those we've known they have. So my question, I feel like it, what can you tell us about your interest in classical myths and stories of antiquity and how you interpret them today? And I know that we touched on that with Voluptuous Mummy, but maybe there's...
Right. Well, I think, and what was so wonderful, I think both of these institutions, both the Armory and the Benton, have really a strong connection. I have a strong connection. One, of course, the Armory being, Pasadena, and my mother growing up in Pasadena, and myself growing, visiting my parents and my grandparents and my cousins in Pasadena. But the other connection would be with the Claremont colleges, because I went to school at Scripps College. And so, Pomona is, equally, even though I went to Scripps, Pomona was part of my stomping grounds. And that's really where I really got entrenched in the classics, I think maybe kicking and screaming. For me, the only way to kind of get through that section of the humanities was to really focus on the art and the form of that art. And so I think it was very influential, not only through ideas, but also through the form. I think, a lot of those figures, their stands are very sort of, Greco-Roman sort of posturing. And then, laid on top of that through materials and textures are these interesting kind of like the African diaspora and really looking at Yoruba and Fon mythologies and different stories that have crossed the Atlantic. And so I really like this sort of convergence because I think a lot of them, mythologies are written to sort of answer our questions about life and our experiences and about things like motherhood and things like loss. And, it is there to provide, I think, comfort and assurance that things will, be resolved. Sometimes, especially in Greek mythology, it's pretty dark, but sometimes resolved in really heinous ways. But I love that these are these kind of key stories that are being told, globally through different characters or different deities, but they all often have these connections in terms of life and death and, birth and children and love and sex and all of those, and war. And so, those themes are constantly coming up in all of these stories, regardless of where you are. And so I love this idea that you can kind of marry these two things together. And again, it kind of, I think, references back to my upbringing and that my, father was, constantly, he on one hand would give me a book on, I think we had this great book on Roman sculptures, which, of course, all of their ivory eyes had fallen out. And I think that was maybe influential in why my figures are eyeless. And then my mother was giving me books on the masks and sculptures of Africa. And so the masks are also eyeless. And so again, these two things kind of come together to kind of create a sort of, I don't want to say my signature, but sort of were really important to me in terms of these kind of the body as a vessel and the spirit and the soul and being able to kind of enter and exit through the eyes. So all these things kind of come through that. But yeah, the mythologies and going back to Hygeia, when I had first proposed that piece, it was pre-pandemic. And, I was just kind of thinking, I've done other pieces that really talk about, I think when my children were young and, I was trying to get into the studio and I had a really wonderful woman who came and watched them during the day. Yvonne was really incredible. And, for me, it was just really incredible the sacrifice that she was making to be there early in the morning and to kind of really spend her day, taking care of my children. And while her own children were back home, and back home meaning in Grenada. And so for me, that sacrifice to kind of leave your family to take care of other people's children and then be able to send money back. And eventually she was able to bring her children here to the United States. But it was just a real powerful thing to think of people both in housekeeping and childcare and elder care and, doing we mentioned charwomen and Hygeia and how these are under-recognized occupations and how these people really basically hold the lives together for those, who are kind of able to have the freedom to do other things that are maybe better paid or better recognized. And so I really kind of have done a number of pieces that are trying to recognize their contribution and how valuable they are, and to sort of encourage people to recognize that and maybe be more, hopefully be more equitable with that. So, and so then, when we were starting to work on Hygeia, after we had agreed to put it in that wonderful space at the Armory, which I love that kind of funny little spot, we then, all of a sudden, everything was needing to be sanitized. And all of a sudden that role, and these being essential workers, finally they were getting some recognition, although sadly, that wasn't necessarily equated in their pay. And sadly, that was also meant that they're often put at risk. So So it's kind of a bittersweet story, but this idea was really to kind of put this piece together and to kind of talk about, not only physical cleaning, but kind of really look at them also as spiritual cleanser, and giving us the ability to live a life that is somewhat, I also think of kind of like a lave-tête, or a cleansing of the mind, and the washing away, or the cooling of the head, which I think also comes back to Imbue, which is the piece that we have that was commissioned for the Benton. So, it's also this kind of, metaphysical and spiritual cleansing as well that I wanted to touch upon.
That's great. Thank you so much. I'm drawing now a little bit from some of the questions that have come in, and some of the comments you were making about Hygeia kind of connect to a question that came up, talking about the labor performed by people who are often under-recognized for that labor, yet who are completely essential to kind of keeping a certain system, the system that we are living in, running. And somebody asked, what is an invisible body? How do your sculptures reveal the invisible body?
Oh, how do my sculptures reveal? I think I'm really interested in, I was thinking about this earlier today because I'm actually curating a show with LA Louvre that really looks at artists that basically the show's called Seen Unseen, and really talks about artists depicting the spirit or things that are not visible. So that could be a deity, that could be a ghost, that could be a haint, whatever. All of these things kind of fall in that category. But I'm really interested, and it's again kind of curious. I think historically a lot of artists have dealt with that, dealt with kind of depicting the invisible through abstraction. And for me, I was really early influenced by, say, Rothko or Albers, and kind of use of color and form to kind of bring, almost transformative and kind of almost visualizing these sort of things, hallucinogenic maybe. But I guess I'm just, then I was kind of talking about invisibility, and that took me, of course, to Ellison's Invisible Man, and invisibility about being, physically being there, but not being seen because of being ignored or not being deemed worthy of recognition. So there's so many levels and layers of invisibility beyond kind of talking about the spirit that it continues to really interest me. And, how can we bring these ideas and issues to light by putting form to them, I guess, is what I'm interested in.
That's great. Thank you. Yeah, I meant to integrate something about Ellison into that question. So thank you for bringing it up. Yeah. Oops.
Well, I think that's also really a big part of Hygeia, that she's in this kind of dark space, and it's got, all of these strung light bulbs and things like that. It also makes me think of James Hampton III and his magnificent, incredible throne that's at the Smithsonian American Art Museum of American Art. And he was a self-taught, I don't know if he would call himself an artist per se. He was a preacher, and he was a janitor during the day. And he would take home, scraps of foil from wrapping or displays, and he would take home all the old used light bulbs and any broken bits of furniture. He would just drag all that back to his garage, and he created this incredible throne, and actually had a congregation, but they had all these crowns, and it was just like, nobody knew this. I mean, well, his congregation knew about it, but, neighbors didn't realize until he had passed, and they opened this garage, and it was just like this gleaming sort of incredible golden arc inside of this garage space. And so, I just love that. And so I think this is kind of a nod to Ellison, a nod to James Hampton, and a nod to all of the men and women that have, toiled during the night to keep places clean, to, give money to their children to go to college, give money to their grandchildren to go to college, or give money to complete strangers to find an education and to further and, improve their life. And I just really wanted to, give recognition to those who have toiled invisibly off the radar of everyone to help, others, to give other people a step up. And I'm just really humbled by their hard work.
Thank you, Allison. There are a couple of questions that I'm trying to kind of consolidate to try to get to them all. We have a question regarding the materials, your choice of materials, your specific, your thinking around your use of materials, and how the materiality expands upon the ideas that you convey in your work. But I do want to tie that to a question regarding your references for scale in your figurative sculptures. What are your references for scale? I'm not sure if that means how do you decide how to scale the work, which I would be curious to hear about. I never actually thought to ask that. But I also wonder if this person is asking about the scale of the work itself that is on display. And
right.
So, and then, yeah, if we have time after that, well, there's another question about the installation after that, but okay. Let's go with that right now.
I guess my work comes in 3 sizes: small, large, and extra large. I think initially the work was, kind of, I wouldn't, well, now no way, I'm going to add another one. There's small, medium, large, and extra large, because this last couple of years I started doing these really tiny carvings, which was a real, I had to get finer tools and actually started doing whittling to do those smaller pieces. But for me, I think, my first experience in terms of making art was really making dolls. And so when you look at Jeté Blanc and even Voluptuous Mummy, they're kind of like doll scale. And in some ways that was great because it allowed me to do these things in the studio that was basically my kitchen, or my mother's kitchen at the time. And it was something that I felt I could control. I didn't really take any sculpture classes. And so I think scale was the most intimidating part of my process. Oops, sorry. And, but then when I think the first time I was able to expand that scale was when I was doing a residency at Roswell Center, well, AIR, so it's an artist in residency in Roswell. And I had a huge studio. It was on the ground floor, and I bought myself a chainsaw. And I also had access to all of this incredible cottonwood that was always being, we were adjacent to an orchard, and there was always all this wood readily available. And so that was really, and I kind of like struggled to really understand how to do something life scale, but I loved that they were life scale. And, one thing that I really love about it is that they don't have to be they're on little plinths so they can actually physically stand up, but I like it that they're not on this pedestal and they're not put up above and sort of somehow separated from the viewer, that they have a one-on-one with the viewer, and that the viewer can walk up to them and recognize them as, an equal, or as, as something really of their scale and within their life and their reality, I guess I should say. And then when I was invited to do public art, I was able to, through the assistance, I would have to again thank Socrates Park and their incredible gift to all the artists that have worked there, in that, this is Socrates Park in New York City, and part of the vision of that was to give artists the opportunity to expand their scale. And of course, we were, had access to hoists and lifts and cranes to do kind of whatever we could conjure up in our minds. And so that really was the first time I was able to kind of go, I think I still did a human scale figure, but she was way up tall sort of thing. And, this was, an incredible gift of Mark de Souvero, who kind of helped facilitate, and initiate Socrates Park. And so that was just a really astounding opportunity that allowed me to kind of go monumental. And since then, working on various commissions and things like, the commission from the Benton or the Harriet Tubman piece in New York City, or Embodied, which is in downtown Los Angeles, all of a sudden these pieces can go up to, 12, 15, 16 feet. And so then that has another impact. And so, each of those scales demand a certain thing of the viewer. Sometimes you want them to be monumental. It's always kind of precarious to make them not monstrous or threatening. And so depending on what the idea is behind that piece, I can adjust it. And, sometimes the smaller pieces are more whimsical. They don't, but to do something really large really takes a huge investment in time and money. So those things have to be really sort of have a real solid sort of idea behind them as well. Does that answer our question? That's part of it. I don't remember what else I was supposed to be addressing.
I think every of these questions has so many ways that we could go that we just have to continue the conversation.
Okay.
I want to ask that we have a question regarding the curatorial and installation decisions. And I'm gonna include both this for both the Benton and the Armory. And I'm going to ask you, Rebecca, to give us just a few. We don't have a lot of time left, and there is one more thing I want to ask before we sign off, and unless there are other questions that come in. But yes, someone's asking specifically about the curatorial installation decisions, and maybe you can start by talking at the Benton for a minute or two, and I'll say something about the Armory for a minute or two.
Okay, that's a good question. I go back to what I said at the beginning. Years ago now, it feels much farther ago than it initially might have been, when the three of us sat down and we were looking at your work and considering how could it work in two venues. And it took shape dramatically, I think, when we knew that Imbue was going to be the sculpture at Pomona. And Imbue, because it's dealing with grounded and watery qualities, the representation of Yemaya and goddess of water, rivers, oceans, passages, and children being at a college. So somehow that helped shape the idea that the works at the Benton should be the works looking at earth and water. So we have Breach, which is representing the two floods that I mentioned earlier, Aphrodite, which represents Yemaya and more watery qualities. And is that, you can jump in anytime, Irene, but I think, so we spent a lot of time considering the physical qualities of the spaces, with one note that because the Benton was not constructed when we started this project, we had never been inside it and we hadn't seen the spaces. So we just had to imagine. We knew what the scale of the galleries were going to be at the Benton, but we knew for sure that the Armories, that the height of the ceiling there and the fact that there's the ledge that you can look over down into the gallery space created an opportunity that we didn't have at the Benton. So it lent itself to that idea of more maybe airy works somehow.
Yeah, at the very least, taking advantage of the height and getting to install some of that work even higher than it had been previously. I think one important thing to note that we hadn't is that, or maybe you did early on, I think you did actually early on, Rebecca, but another early curatorial decision was to focus on female figures. I think we said that, but it bears maybe repeating here since this is a question about curatorial and installation decisions. So, it was a really exciting and huge notion for me anyway, to think about how to focus an exhibition around the work of Alison Saar, an artist who's been producing artwork for decades and who has such a huge, expansive, amazing body of work. And so there were a number of logics that we applied to kind of begin to kind of narrow down our scope a bit. Some were pragmatic and others were aesthetic or content based, I suppose. So yes, that, Rebecca, thank you for that overview. I think another, I guess, characteristic of the Armory is that we integrated, I mean, both, there's color represented in both exhibitions, the color of the beautiful book behind Rebecca and me, the catalog designed by Kimberly Varela that accompanies this exhibition, has this really distinctive goldenrod, we call it, goldenrod color cover. And we both venues wanted to integrate that somehow into the exhibition. And at the Benton, when you go, you'll see that the wall didactic, the kind of language that appears when you first enter the exhibition, is in this beautiful color. And we at the Armory integrated the color into the exhibition design a little bit. So I hope that answers the question.
Questions are rolling in.
Oh, they really are now. Oh my gosh, how do we do this in the last few minutes? Oh my goodness. Somebody, this is a huge question at this very last minute, but I'm going to ask, how do the themes or issues of the elements around which the two shows seem to have been constructed relate specifically to the subject of historical, institutionalized, and terribly chronic racism, which plagues our country and world today? That's a big one to answer in a minute. And you don't have your mic on.
That to me one more time. I'm sorry.
How do the themes or issues of the elements around which the two shows have been constructed relate specifically to the subject of historical, institutionalized, and terribly chronic racism, which plagues our country and world today? Which maybe isn't fair to point to you to answer, Alison. Maybe this is something Rebecca and I should answer.
Well, I would say, I think that the looking at elements of Aether and Earthe is just a structure that provides, one could say most of Alison's work, I think, touches on subjects of historical and institutionalized racism in one way or another. And so that is the thread. You know, we talked at the beginning about how we were so intrigued with focusing on female figures, but race and gender.
Mm-hmm. Right. I'm going to try to make these quick. Maybe let's see. Somebody wants to know what artwork you would like to make that you haven't, a different material, theme, subject matter, etc.
Oh gosh.
You're working in video now.
Yeah, I don't know if that's my how far that's going to go for this catfish piece, but you know, every once in a while something comes up. I think because my sort of education in sculpture has really just been by the grace of anyone who was able to come and offer up some new techniques to me. You know, I've recently been doing a lot of printmaking, which is actually something that is connected with my, you know, my mother was a printmaker, and I think, you know, I grew up basically crawling around at Long Beach's print department. So printmaking has been something that I've come to more recently. And actually, you know, painting and drawing is something that I've never really explored much. And, you know, and I think that's maybe since the last 2 or 3 shows has become more prominent. But you know, it's curious, and it's something I've always been fascinated with, and whether I'll ever actually do anything with it, is I've always been intrigued with blacksmithing. You know, I kind of one of the sort of diasporic deities that I try to pay tribute to and appease is Ogun, the god of blacksmithing. And, you know, I think part of that is because I use chainsaws and very sharp tools and want to kind of keep myself safe and my studio safe, and sort of give him thanks for helping divert any sort of disasters. I'm also going to knock on wood, hitting all bases here. And so I'm just always been really intrigued with that. And then after seeing the incredible show at the Fowler, I'm blanking out on the name of that forged.
Oh,
any rate, incredible, incredible exhibition, looking at ironwork and blacksmithing. And so I've always been really intrigued with that. Maybe also growing up around horses as a kid and seeing farriers mold metal. But I think that sort of transformation of steel through heat. And I guess I'm hitting a little bit on that when I'm casting, melting metal and pouring it into molds and kind of creating these things. But I'm also just, I like getting in there, and actually you can see my hands starting to clamp up. But I'm always really intrigued, and I never could figure out what I would do with that per se, but that's something I've always been intrigued to explore. Just, again, going back to the Fowler, when you walk into that space, the design was really incredible. And you walk underneath this sort of passageway, you kind of go in through this tunnel, and projections of blood corpuscles are floating overhead. And this idea that, if you cut yourself, as I did just a moment ago, and you taste your blood, you can taste the iron in it, and that that metal is in us. And I just think it is just such an incredible, powerful connection with that. So maybe one of these days I'll learn how to do some forging.
Thanks, Alison. We have friends posting that the show is called Striking Iron.
Thank you so much. I was having a senior moment there.
We're gonna sign off, but right before we do, I'm just gonna ask you quickly, because I'm trying to be mindful of time and we're over already, but somebody wants to just know if you can just list where you've traveled and what destinations are still on your list. And somebody else wants to know if there are plans for your work to be exhibited in the Bay Area anytime soon.
Gosh. Nothing in the wings for the Bay Area. I love it up there, but have yet to really have I guess my mother and I showed there in the Oakland Museum with the show that we did together that started at UCLA. Similar, and also someone can tell me what the name of that show was. Thank you. Thinking out on that. And travels, for all of my references to so many wonderful places, the only places that I've really been in the continent has been Senegal, which was a really incredible experience, but way too short and not enough time to really kind of experience things on the level I would like to. We're still kind of consigned to hotels and things like that. So I would love, to explore North and South and Central Africa. I think would be really intriguing. And I'm also really, I'm really close to trying to get myself to Cuba. I had the opportunity once many years ago, but my son was a child and I didn't feel safe leaving him in New York and going by myself, and they wouldn't allow children to travel at the time. That there was still, well, as there still is today, constrictions on who could come in and out of Cuba. But Cuba I would love to go to, and Brazil as well. So those are at the top of my list. Hopefully when travel opens up again, I can start to click those things off, check them off.
Well, this has been an amazing evening. I want to thank you, Alison, so much. And thank you, Rebecca, for hosting this with me, and Eber, thanks for your work as well. And thanks to all of our guests tonight. I'm sorry we couldn't get to all of the questions, but follow us. There will be more opportunities for conversation, and please follow the Benton, follow the Armory, and keep your eyes out for more programming related to Alison Saar's of Aether and Earthe. And I just thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for coming.
Looking at the list of all the people that are there here, thank you so much. I wish I could reach out and say hey to you individually, but thank you all for coming. Great to see you.
We'll see some of you tomorrow or in future visits to our institutions.
That's right.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Good night.
Bye-bye.